Get out! Now!
No, Your Grace.
What did you say? Do you understand English, or must someone translate my contempt?
I understand you perfectly.
Then obey me. You were given one simple instruction.
You asked me to lie.
Careful, Miss Hartwell.
No.
You should be careful.
Shouting at a woman before 300 witnesses because she refused to lie for you tells everyone.
Where's that title? 3 weeks earlier.
The Duke's voice cracked through the ballroom like a whip. Get out. Now. Every crystal glass in Lord Ashcombe's grand hall seemed to hold its breath. Conversations died, mid-sentence. A string quartet faltered, bows freezing above their instruments. 200 of London's most powerful men and women turned as one, their jeweled necks craning toward the source of the disturbance toward the Duke of Ravensmoor, standing rigid in the center of the marble floor, his face carved from fury. His finger pointed at a woman in a plain gray uniform who did not move. She did not flinch. She did not cower. She stood there with a silver tray balanced against her hip, her dark curls falling loose from their pins, her curves filling out the modest uniform in a way that made the noblewomen around her sniff with disdain, and the noblemen glance twice before catching themselves. I said, "Get out." Stellan Valen, Duke of Ravensmoor, repeated, his voice lower now, but somehow more dangerous. "Do you understand English, or shall I have someone translate my contempt for you?" The room waited for her to break, for her chin to drop, for tears. Instead, Dahlia Hartwell set her tray down on the nearest table with deliberate, unhurried grace, straightened her spine, and looked the most feared man in England directly in the eyes. "You can shout at me all you like, Your Grace," she said, her voice carrying clean and clear across the stunned silence of the hall. "But shouting at a woman in front of 300 witnesses because she refused to lie for you, that tells everyone in this room exactly what kind of man wears that title." The chandelier light seemed to dim. Somewhere a champagne flute shattered against marble. Nobody moved, nobody breathed. And the Duke of Ravensmoor, a man who had faced down political rivals, who had buried his own father without shedding a public tear, who had never once in his 34 years been rendered speechless, stood frozen, his mouth slightly parted, his gray eyes locked on a woman who had just done what no duchess, no minister, no king had ever managed to do. She had made him doubt himself. But to understand how a duke came to shout at a waitress in the middle of the season's most important ball, and how one sentence from her lips would unravel a lifetime of careful lies, we must go back. 3 weeks, to be exact. To a rain-soaked Tuesday evening when Dahlia Hartwell was simply trying to survive her shift, and Stellan Valen walked into her life like a storm that had been building for years, waiting only for the right woman to break against. The Wilting Rose was not the sort of establishment that entertained dukes. It sat on a narrow side street 2 blocks from the more fashionable restaurants of Mayfair, its brick facade weathered, its windows fogged with the warmth of a kitchen that never quite stopped working. Inside, the air smelled of roasted lamb and burnt sugar, of candle wax and old wood polished 100 years soft. It was the kind of place where working men came to forget their debts, where actresses came to escape their agents, and where, on a particularly miserable Tuesday in early autumn, Dahlia Hartwell was balancing 4 plates on one arm while dodging a table of drunken bankers who had already tried, twice, to pull her into their laps. She was 26 years old, with a body that curved generously at the hip and bust, thighs that strained the seams of her uniform skirt, no matter how many alterations she requested, and a face that men often called pretty only after they'd finished commenting on everything else first. She had learned, over years of waiting tables in a city that worshipped thinness like a religion, to let such comments slide off her like rain off a well-oiled coat. She had learned to smile without meaning it, to laugh at jokes that weren't funny, to accept the extra pinch or wandering hand as an occupational hazard rather than an outrage because outrage did not pay rent, and her mother's medicine did not purchase itself. What she had not learned, what she would never learn, no matter how many years passed, was how to stop noticing when a man walked into a room and every other man in it seemed to shrink. The Duke of Ravensmoor entered the Wilting Rose at exactly 8:17 in the evening, shaking rain from a coat so finely tailored it looked as though it had been sewn directly onto his shoulders. He was taller than any man Dahlia had served that night, with dark hair damp against his forehead and a jaw that looked as though it had been chiseled by someone determined to prove a point about masculine beauty. His eyes were the gray of storm clouds before they broke, and when they swept across the dim little restaurant, they seemed to catalogue every exit, every threat, every weakness in the room within the space of 2 seconds. He did not belong here. That much was obvious from the way conversations stuttered, the way the bankers at table 6 sat up straighter, the way old Mrs. Fenwick at the corner table actually gasped and clutched her pearls. Dahlia, who had no idea who he was, simply saw a wet, irritated man standing in her section, and did what she did with every customer. She plastered on a smile and walked toward him. "Table for one, sir." He looked at her, then really looked, in a way that made her suddenly acutely aware of the flour dusted across her apron, the loose curls stuck to her damp forehead. The exhaustion she was certain showed in the set of her shoulders after a 10-hour shift. His gray eyes moved over her face first, then briefly, almost against his will down the length of her, taking in curves she had spent a decade being told to apologize for. She waited for the look, the one she knew so well. The slight curl of the lip, the barely concealed judgment, the swift retreat of interest once a man remembered that society had taught him beauty came in one shape only. It didn't come. Instead, something flickered across his face that she couldn't quite name: surprise, perhaps, or the particular unsettlement of a man encountering something he hadn't planned for. "Yes," he said finally, his voice deep and clipped, edged with the kind of authority that came from a lifetime of never being told no. "Somewhere quiet." "Everywhere's quiet here, love," she said, gesturing at the half-empty dining room. "It's Tuesday." Something that might have been the ghost of a smile crossed his mouth before he caught it and smoothed it away, as though smiling were a weakness he could not afford to display in public. "Then anywhere will do." She led him to a table near the back, away from the drunken bankers, away from the drafty door. He shed his coat. She caught a glimpse of an expensive silk lining, a monogram she didn't recognize embroidered near the collar, and folded himself into the chair with the careful economy of movement that men of a certain upbringing always seemed to possess, as though they'd been trained since birth never to waste a gesture. "Something to drink?" she asked, pen poised over her notepad. "Whatever you'd recommend," he said, and there was something almost like a challenge in the words, as though he expected her to falter, to defer immediately to the assumption that he knew better than she did about anything at all. She didn't falter. "The house red's cheap, and it's better than it has any right to be. Or if you're feeling fancy, we've got a decent port that old Tom in the kitchen swears came off a ship that used to smuggle for pirates. I don't believe him, but it tastes good enough that I don't ask questions." For the second time in as many minutes, something shifted behind those storm-gray eyes. "The port, then. I find I'm in the mood for something with a story attached to it." "Aren't we all?" she murmured, and turned to fetch it before she could see whether he'd heard her. He had. Stellan Valen had not intended to end up in a working-class tavern on a Tuesday night. He had intended, as he did most evenings, to sit alone in his study at Ravensmoor House with a glass of brandy and the crushing silence of a home built for a family that no longer existed within its walls. He had intended to review the estate ledgers his steward had left him, to draft the letter to the Prime Minister's office regarding the trade legislation his committee had been debating for weeks, to do anything at all that would keep his mind occupied and away from the date circled in red on his desk calendar, the anniversary of his father's death. 3 years now, and still the house felt like a mausoleum every October. Instead, his carriage had broken a wheel 2 streets from his townhouse, and rather than wait in the rain for a replacement, he had walked. And walking, in the rain, in a part of London he rarely had cause to visit, he had found himself standing outside a small, warmly lit restaurant with a crooked sign reading "The Wilting Rose," and something hunger, curiosity, the desperate need to be anywhere but his own house on this particular night had pulled him inside. He had not expected the waitress. Stellan had grown up surrounded by a very particular kind of beauty, the kind cultivated in finishing schools and enforced by corsets. The kind that arrived at balls in gowns designed to make a woman look as though she required no sustenance at all, as though hunger itself were beneath her station. He had danced with countesses whose waists he could nearly span with his 2 hands, had been introduced to a parade of eligible young women handpicked by his late mother for their pedigree and their proportions in equal measure, had spent 34 years being told, implicitly and explicitly, that a woman's worth could be measured in inches of silk fabric saved. He had never, not once, felt his breath catch the way it did when Dahlia Hartwell approached his table with that tired, genuine smile and asked what he'd like to drink. She was not thin. Her curves filled the plain gray uniform in ways that would have scandalized his mother's dressmaker. Her hips wide, her bosom generous, her arms soft where the ladies of his acquaintance kept theirs whittled thin through diet and denial. And yet there was something in the way she carried herself unapologetic, unbowed, utterly unconcerned with whether he approved of the space she took up in the world that struck him with the force of a physical blow. He watched her walk away to fetch his port and found himself, absurdly, unable to look away from the sway of her hips, the confidence in her stride, the way she laughed at something one of the drunk bankers said, and swatted his hand away from her waist without breaking her rhythm, as though she'd been fending off wandering hands since she was old enough to carry a tray, and had simply stopped letting it cost her anything. "You're staring, Your Grace," said a voice at his elbow. Stellan startled an unfamiliar sensation for a man who prided himself on never being caught off guard and turned to find an elderly woman at the neighboring table watching him with sharp, knowing eyes. "Mrs. Fenwick, if he recalled the whispered name correctly. I beg your pardon?" "That girl." Mrs. Fenwick nodded toward the bar, where Dahlia was pouring his port with the careful precision of someone who took pride even in small tasks. "Dahlia, sweetest thing in London, and the hardest worked, though you'd never hear her complain. Mother's ill, you know, consumption. That girl works 2 jobs, and hasn't taken a holiday in 3 years, all to keep her mother in medicine and a roof over both their heads." The old woman's eyes narrowed slightly. "She deserves better than to be stared at like a confection in a shop window, Your Grace. Whoever you are." Stellan felt heat climb his neck shame, he realized, an emotion he experienced so rarely he nearly didn't recognize it. "I meant no disrespect." Said Mrs. Fenwick, in the tone of a woman who had heard that particular reassurance from a great many men and believed approximately none of them. "See that you don't offer any, then." When Dahlia returned with his port, Stellan found himself, for the first time in longer than he could remember, uncertain of what to say. "Everything all right?" she asked, setting the glass down with a soft clink. "You've got a look on your face like you've swallowed a bee." "I was told," he said slowly, "that I was staring rudely at you. I wish to apologize if that was the case." Dahlia blinked, clearly startled by the admission. Men did not, in her experience, apologize for staring. They either denied it outright or doubled down, as though her noticing were somehow the greater offense. "Well," she said finally, recovering, "that's a first. Most gents just pretend they were admiring the wallpaper. The wallpaper is objectively unremarkable." A laugh escaped her before she could stop it, a real one, warm and startled out of her, and something in Stellan's chest loosened at the sound of it in a way that alarmed him more than it should have. "You've got a strange way of apologizing, sir. I've been told I have a strange way of doing most things." "Who told you that?" "Everyone," he said, and this time it was his mouth that curved, just slightly, into something that wasn't quite a smile but was trying very hard to remember how. "My entire life, if I'm honest." Dahlia studied him for a moment, his fine coat, his careful posture, the exhaustion beneath his cool composure that she recognized because she wore the same expression every night in the mirror before bed. "Well," she said finally, "for what it's worth, strange is not the worst thing a man can be. I've served plenty of ordinary ones who were far worse company." She left to attend her other tables before he could respond, and Stellan Valens sat alone in the corner of a working-class tavern, nursing a glass of smuggler's port, and realized with something like horror that he had just spent the better part of 10 minutes more engaged, more alive, than he had felt in the 3 years since his father's funeral. He returned to the Wilting Rose the following Tuesday, and the Tuesday after that. By the 3rd week, the staff of the Wilting Rose had begun to whisper. "He's here for you," insisted Nettie, the youngest of the waitresses, a sharp-eyed girl of 19 who had appointed herself the establishment's unofficial gossip correspondent. 3 weeks running, same table, same night, and he won't so much as look at the menu until you've brought it to him yourself. "I heard he's a duke, Dahlia. An actual duke." "He's a customer," Dahlia said firmly, though her cheeks warmed traitorously as she loaded a tray with plates. "A generous tipper and a decent conversationalist, and that's the whole of it." "Decent conversationalist," Nettie repeated, rolling her eyes toward the ceiling as though appealing to a higher power for patience. You spent 40 minutes at his table last Tuesday discussing philosophy. Philosophy, Dahlia. I don't even know what half those words mean. She had, in fact, spent 40 minutes at his table discussing philosophy, though it had started innocuously enough with a comment about the rain, and somehow spiraled into a genuine debate about whether happiness could be manufactured through duty, or whether it required something less obedient than duty to survive. Stellan Valen, she had discovered over 3 Tuesdays, was not merely handsome in the cold, sculpted way of men born to privilege. He was startlingly intelligent, quick-witted, in a manner that matched her own sharp tongue blow for blow, and possessed of a loneliness so profound it sometimes leaked through his careful composure like water through a crack in stone. He never spoke of his title. He never mentioned his estates, his political influence, his position among the peerage that made grown men bow and women curtsy in the street. To Dahlia, for 3 glorious Tuesdays, he had simply been Stellan, a man with tired eyes and a quick mind who seemed to find more peace in her small, unglamorous corner of London than he found anywhere else in his gilded life. She should have known it couldn't last. She should have known that a man like that, whatever he truly was, belonged to a world that would never permit him to sit in a working tavern discussing philosophy with a curvy waitress indefinitely. She found out exactly how large that world was on the 4th Tuesday, when he didn't come alone. The woman who entered the wilting rose alongside Stellan Valen that evening moved like she had been poured from silk, and expected the world to part for her, which, Dahlia would learn later, it generally did. She was tall and elegant, in the way that fashion plates were elegant, narrow-waisted, pale-skinned, with golden hair swept into an elaborate style that must have taken her lady's maid the better part of 2 hours to construct. Her gown, even beneath a modest traveling coat, was clearly the work of a Parisian designer, and her eyes, when they swept across the humble dining room, held the particular contempt of someone encountering something beneath her notice for the very first time. "Stellan, darling, must we really eat here?" her voice carried, pitched to be heard, pitched for an audience. "It smells of boiled cabbage. It smells of roasted lamb, Lady Cordelia," Stellan said, and Dahlia, frozen halfway across the dining room with a tray balanced on her hip, heard something flat and careful enter his voice, the voice, she realized with a slow, sinking dread, of a man performing a role rather than simply speaking. "And you insisted on accompanying me tonight, if I recall, only because you've been unbearably secretive about your Tuesday evenings for a month now, and Mother was beginning to worry you'd taken up with actresses." Lady Cordelia's laugh was bright and brittle, like breaking glass dressed up as music. "Though I confess I expected something rather more scandalous than a public house." Dahlia set her tray down on an empty table with hands that had gone suddenly unsteady and tried very hard not to listen, and failed completely. "Lady Cordelia Ashcombe," Nettie whispered urgently at her elbow, having appeared from nowhere the way she always did when there was gossip to be harvested. "Daughter of the Earl of Sherborne. They say her father's been trying to marry her off to Ravensmoor for 2 years now. They say it's practically settled." Ravensmoor, the name landed in Dahlia's chest like a stone dropped down a well, sinking and sinking without ever quite reaching the bottom. "Ravensmoor," she repeated numbly. As in the Duke of Ravensmoor, yes." Nettie's eyes were enormous, darting between Dahlia's stricken face and the elegant couple now being seated by Nettie herself, apparently, since Dahlia hadn't moved at what had become, over the past month, Stellan's regular table. "Dahlia, did you not know? Everyone in London knows the Duke of Ravensmoor. He's practically the most powerful man in the peerage, next to the king himself. He sits on half the government committees. His family's owned half of Yorkshire since the conquest. And, 'I have to work,' Dahlia said, cutting her off, and picking her tray back up with hands she was forced into steadiness through sheer, stubborn will. She served their table herself. She told herself it was because it was her section, because it would be strange to hand it off now, because she was a professional and professionals did not flee from difficult tables simply because their hearts had just been quietly, thoroughly broken by a man who had never once thought to mention he was betrothed or as good as to an Isle's daughter. Stellan would not meet her eyes when she approached. That, more than anything, told her everything she needed to know. "The lamb is excellent tonight," she said, her voice a marvel of professional brightness, even as something cold and heavy settled in her stomach. "Might I recommend it, Your Grace?" She watched him flinch, very slightly, at the title as though hearing it from her mouth cost him something. "That will be fine," he said quietly, still not looking at her. Lady Cordelia, meanwhile, was studying Dahlia with the frank, appraising interest of a woman assessing a rival she did not yet believe posed any genuine threat. "And what's your name, girl?" "Dahlia, my lady." "Dahlia." Cordelia's lips curved, not unkindly, but with the particular condescension of someone who found the entire situation rather amusing. "How quaint. Stellan, is this your little discovery? The one you've been sneaking off to see every Tuesday like a schoolboy?" She turned back to Dahlia before he could answer, her pale eyes sweeping down and then up, taking in every curve the plain uniform failed to disguise. "Well, I can certainly see the appeal in a rustic sort of way, though I'd have thought a man of Ravensmoor's tastes would prefer something a bit more refined." The words landed exactly where they were meant to land, precise as a surgeon's blade. Dahlia had absorbed 1,000 comments like it over the years about her size, her class, her presumption in existing loudly in spaces that preferred women who apologized for taking up room, and she had built, brick by careful brick, a wall thick enough to withstand them. But this one came from the mouth of a woman about to marry the man Dahlia had spent a month falling for without permission, without warning, without any say in the matter at all. And it hurt in a way she hadn't braced herself against. "I'll bring your lamb," she said, and walked away before either of them could see her face crumble, even slightly, at the seams. She did not return to their table again that evening. She sent Nettie instead, and busied herself in the kitchen with tasks that did not require her to look anywhere near the back corner where a duke sat across from his intended bride, and did not once, glance toward the woman he'd spent a month pretending was the only interesting thing in his entire gilded life. He left an enormous tip. Nettie brought it to her with wide, sympathetic eyes. Dahlia left it on the table. He came back the following Tuesday, alone. Dahlia saw him through the kitchen window before he'd even fully entered, and her first instinct, cowardly, she knew, but real nonetheless, was to duck into the pantry and let Nettie take his table. She didn't. Whatever else she was, Dahlia Hartwell had never once in her life run from a difficult conversation, and she was not about to start now, not for a duke who had let her believe, for a month of stolen Tuesday evenings, that she mattered to him more than she apparently did. "Table for one," he said, when she approached, and his gray eyes held something that looked almost like an apology, though he hadn't yet said the words. "Right this way, your grace," she said, cool and professional, and led him to his usual table without another word. He waited until she'd set down his port unasked, because some habits were hard to break even when you were furious with a man before he spoke. "I owe you an explanation." "You don't owe me anything," she said, and was proud of how steady her voice came out. "You're a duke. I'm a waitress. I served you a nice meal and some decent conversation for a month, and that's the whole of our arrangement, isn't it? No explanations required. Dahlia." It was the first time he'd said her name, not miss, not girl, not any of the diminishing forms of address she'd grown so accustomed to swallowing without complaint, and something in the way he said it, low and careful, like it mattered to get right, made her chest ache, despite every instinct telling her not to let it. "There is no formal arrangement between myself and Lady Cordelia," he said. "There is a hope, on the part of her family and mine, that one might be forged. There is a great deal of pressure, from my mother, from the House of Lords, from a peerage that has been whispering for 3 years, that a duke without a duchess is a duke without a future. There is no love, there has never been love, and there was no honesty on my part in failing to mention any of this to you sooner, and for that I am genuinely sorry." Dahlia crossed her arms over her chest, suddenly, achingly aware of how the gesture pushed her curves against the fabric of her uniform, and hated herself for the awareness, for the way some traitorous part of her still cared what he thought of the body she'd spent so long teaching herself not to apologize for. "Why does it matter?" she said. "What do you explain to me?" "I'm a waitress at a tavern, your grace. You're going to marry an earl's daughter and inherit half of Yorkshire, or whatever it was," Nettie said. "I'll still be here, pouring port for whoever walks through that door, whether you visit on Tuesdays or not." "It matters," Stellan said, and there was something raw beneath his careful composure now, something that made him look younger, less certain, more like the man who had admitted to her, 3 weeks prior, that he found more peace in her section of a working tavern than anywhere in his own grand house. "Because I have spent 34 years being exactly what everyone expected me to be, and in 1 month, in this," he gestured, almost helplessly, at the small, dim dining room around them. This unglamorous, unremarkable little tavern, with a waitress who owes me nothing and flatters me not at all. I have felt more like myself than I have in a decade, and I did not know how to tell you that without it sounding exactly as absurd and inappropriate as I'm certain it sounds now. Dahlia's arms loosened, slightly, against her will. That's a lovely speech, Your Grace, but it doesn't change anything, does it? You're still going to marry her, or someone like her, and I'm still going to be exactly what I am. And what is that? He asked, quietly. What are you, Dahlia, that you speak of it as though it were something lesser? She opened her mouth to answer some sharp, deflecting comment about class and money and the enormous, unbridgeable gulf between a duke and a curvy waitress from a family with more debts than prospects, and found, to her own frustration, that the words wouldn't come. Because the truth was, in that dim tavern light, with his gray eyes fixed on her like she was the only interesting thing in the entire room, she didn't feel lesser. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt seen. I have to get back to work, she said instead, and fled before he could see how badly the deflection had failed. But she found herself, against every ounce of her better judgment, looking forward to the following Tuesday anyway. Over the weeks that followed, something shifted between them, slow and careful, like ice thawing at the edges of a pond too deep to trust all at once. He did not propose anything untoward. He did not offer her money, or jewels, or the sort of arrangement wealthy men sometimes offered women of her station when they wanted something without the inconvenience of respectability. Instead, he simply kept coming, Tuesday after Tuesday, and their conversations deepened in ways Dahlia found herself unable to resist, despite every warning bell clanging in the back of her mind. He learned her mother was named Josephine, that she'd been ill with consumption for 3 years, that Dahlia's father had died when she was 19 and left them with debts instead of an inheritance. He learned that Dahlia had wanted, once, to study medicine, before life had rerouted her towards silver trays and double shifts instead. He learned that she read novels by candlelight after her mother fell asleep, that she had strong opinions about Dickens and stronger ones about the men who wrote romance novels without ever once speaking to a real woman. And Dahlia learned things, too, that Stellan's father had been cold and demanding, that his mother had died when he was 12 and left him raised almost entirely by tutors and expectation, that he had a younger sister, Wren, who was the only person in his family he trusted without reservation, and that he had never, not once in his adult life, chosen anything for himself without first calculating what it would cost the dukedom. "You're the first thing I've wanted," he admitted one Tuesday, 3 months into their strange, careful friendship, without first asking whether it was appropriate. "That's rather a low bar, Your Grace," she said, though her voice had softened, the honorific losing some of its earlier bite. "It's the highest bar I've ever cleared," he said, and meant it. She should have stopped it there. She knew she should have. A Duke and a Waitress, it was the plot of exactly the sort of romance novel she rolled her eyes at, the sort of fantasy that existed in fiction precisely because it could not survive contact with reality. Society would never accept it. His family would never accept it. Lady Cordelia and the Earl her father, and the entire glittering apparatus of the peerage that had been maneuvering Stellan toward a suitable match, since before he could walk none of them would simply step aside, because a duke had found, in a working tavern, a woman who made him feel like himself for the first time in a decade. But Dahlia Hartwell had never been particularly good at doing what she should, and somewhere in the slow accumulation of Tuesday evenings, she had fallen helplessly, foolishly, entirely for a man she had no earthly right to want. It was on a Tuesday in late November, with the first frost silvering the windows of the wilting rose, that he finally touched her for the first time. It was nothing scandalous, simply his hand, closing over hers as she set down his glass, his thumb brushing lightly across her knuckles in a gesture so gentle it nearly undid her entirely. "Dahlia," he said, low, and there was something in his gray eyes that she had never seen there before, something unguarded, something that looked almost like fear, as though he were standing at the edge of a cliff he'd spent his whole life being warned against, and had decided, finally, to jump anyway. "I know what I am asking in wanting this. I know the cost, to you more than to me, if this were ever discovered. But I find I cannot stop wanting it regardless, and I would rather know now, plainly, whether you want it too, than spend one more Tuesday pretending this is merely a conversation between a duke and a waitress who happen to enjoy discussing Dickens." Her heart was hammering so loudly she was certain he could hear it. Stellan, she said his name, unguarded, for the first time. You're going to marry Lady Cordelia, or someone like her. That hasn't changed. Nothing is settled, he said. Nothing has been signed. And I find, the longer I sit across from you in this tavern, the less I care what my mother or the House of Lords believes I ought to want. His thumb moved again, slow, deliberate, across her hand. Tell me to stop, Dahlia, and I will. I will finish my port and leave, and never trouble you with this again. But if there is even a fraction of you that wants what I want, she should have told him to stop. She turned her hand over instead, so that her palm pressed against his, curling her fingers slowly around his own, and watched something in his face break open with a relief so profound it looked almost like pain. This is going to end badly, she whispered. You know that, don't you? Men like you don't get to choose women like me. Not really. Not where it counts. Then let it end badly, he said, later. Tonight, let it simply be true. She should have known, even then, that later would come faster than either of them wanted, and that it would arrive not quietly, not privately, but in the middle of the most important ball of the season, in front of 300 witnesses, with a shout that would freeze all of high society in place. But that Tuesday, with frost silvering the windows and his hand warm around hers, Dahlia allowed herself, just once, to believe that love might be enough to survive the gulf between a duke and a curvy waitress. She did not yet know about the letter arriving at Ravensmoor House, the following morning, the one bearing the seal of the Earl of Sherborne, formally proposing the union between his daughter and the Duke, with a deadline for response before the season's grand ball. She did not know about Lady Cordelia's growing suspicion, nor about the private investigator her father would soon hire to follow Stellan's Tuesday evenings to their source. She did not know that a woman believed dead for over a decade, a woman whose name, when it finally surfaced, would shatter everything Stellan believed about his own family was, even now, quietly making her way back toward London, drawn by rumors of a duke who had finally, after years of cold obedience, begun to choose his own heart. All Dahlia knew, that frosty November Tuesday, was the warmth of his hand around hers, and the terrifying, wonderful certainty that she had fallen in love with a man the world would never let her keep. The storm was coming, but for one more night, she let herself believe in the calm before it. The weeks that followed unfolded, like a secret neither of them quite dared name aloud. Stellan began arriving not only on Tuesdays, but whenever his schedule permitted, a stolen half-hour during a rain delay between committee meetings, a late supper after a tedious dinner with visiting dignitaries he could not politely refuse. Dahlia found herself watching the door of the Wilting Rose with an anticipation she scolded herself for and could not extinguish, her pulse quickening every time the bell above the entrance chimed, and there was even the slimmest chance it might be him. He brought her small things, at first nothing so bold as jewelry, which she would have refused outright, but a book of poetry he thought she might enjoy, a warm shawl when he noticed her shivering during a particularly bitter cold snap, a jar of the honey her mother's doctor had recommended for her cough, procured from an apiary on the Ravensmoor estate itself, and delivered without comment, as though it were nothing at all rather than a gesture that made Dahlia's throat tighten with unexpected emotion. You didn't need to do that, she told him, holding the jar of honey like it might shatter. I know, he said simply. I wanted to. It was, she was coming to understand, the way he loved not through grand declarations, not yet, but through small, careful attentions that revealed how closely he was listening, how much he noticed, how deeply he had begun to care for details of her life that most men of his station would never think to ask about. He asked about her mother constantly, and when Josephine Hartwell's cough worsened in December, it was Stellan, not Dahlia, who could never have afforded it, who quietly arranged for a specialist from Harley Street to visit their modest flat, framing it, when Dahlia protested, as merely calling in a favor from an old family physician who happened to be in the area. You can't keep doing things like this, Dahlia said one evening, sitting across from him at their usual table, her voice torn between gratitude and something that felt uncomfortably close to shame. People will talk, and I don't, Stellan. I don't want to be someone's charity case. I don't want to be kept. You are not being kept, he said, and something fierce entered his voice, a protectiveness that startled her with its intensity. I would burn down every physician's office in London before I let your mother suffer for want of care I am perfectly capable of providing. This has nothing to do with charity, Dahlia, and everything to do with the fact that I love you, and I cannot bear to watch someone I love suffer when I have the means to prevent it." The word hung in the air, between them love, spoken plainly for the first time, without hedging or hesitation. Dahlia's breath caught. "You've never said that before." "I've been a coward about saying it," he admitted, "because saying it makes it real, and real means consequence, and I have spent my entire life being trained to avoid consequence at all costs. But I am done being a coward. Dahlia Hartwell, I love you. I have loved you, I think, since the third Tuesday, when you told me strange wasn't the worst thing a man could be. I would like, very much, for you to know that plainly, whatever comes of it." She reached across the table and took his hand. Tears she refused to shed burning hot behind her eyes. "I love you too," she whispered. "God help me, I do." It should have been a moment of pure joy, and for a few precious seconds it was. But even as the words left her mouth, the bell above the tavern door chimed, and Dahlia looked up to see a woman she did not recognize standing in the doorway, elegant, dark-haired, watching the two of them with an expression of such raw, complicated emotion that Dahlia's stomach dropped before the stranger had even spoken a word. "Stellan," the woman said, her voice trembling, "I need you to know that I'm not dead, and I need you to know what your father did to make certain everyone believed I was." Stellan went white as bone. "Mother?" he said, and the word broke in half on his tongue. The wilting rose fell utterly silent, every patron frozen, as the woman the entire peerage had mourned for over 2 decades stepped fully into the candlelight, and Dahlia Hartwell realized, with dawning horror, that whatever fragile happiness she and Stellan had built in this small, unglamorous tavern was about to be tested by a secret far larger and far more dangerous than a duke's disapproving fiancée. The woman standing in the doorway of the wilting rose was, Dahlia would later understand, meant to have been buried in the Ravensmoor family crypt for over 2 decades. Her name was Helene Valen, once Duchess of Ravensmoor, mother to the man now staring at her as though the floor had opened beneath his polished boots. She was perhaps 60, her dark hair silvered at the temples but still thick, her face lined with the particular weariness of someone who had spent years in hiding, watching the world move on without her. Her traveling cloak was plain, unremarkable, the clothing of a woman who had learned to disappear into crowds rather than stand out among them, a strange inversion, Dahlia thought distantly, of the life she must once have led as a duchess. "That's not possible," Stellan said, his voice hollow, stripped of every ounce of the composure Dahlia had come to associate with him. "You died. I was 12. I stood at your grave. I watched them lower the casket." "You watched them lower a casket," Helene said, her own voice trembling but steady beneath the tremor, like a woman who had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in her mind and was only now discovering how inadequate rehearsal had been. "What was inside it, I cannot say with certainty, though I suspect it was considerably lighter than a grown woman's remains ought to be." The few remaining patrons of the wilting rose had gone utterly silent, watching the scene unfold with the particular hunger of people who understood, instinctively, that they were witnessing something that would become the talk of London within the week. Dahlia, still seated across from Stellan, felt suddenly, acutely aware that she had no right to be present for this, that this was a wound decades in the making, tearing open in front of strangers, and she was the least equipped person in the room to offer comfort for it. "I should go," she murmured, half rising. Stellan's hand shot out and caught her wrist, gently but with unmistakable urgency. "Stay," he said, not looking away from his mother. "Please." Helene's eyes moved to Dahlia, then assessing, careful, though without the cold contempt Lady Cordelia had shown weeks earlier. If anything, there was something like recognition in the older woman's gaze, as though she understood exactly what it meant for her son to ask a woman to stay for a conversation this raw. "We should not have this discussion here," Helene said quietly. "There are ears in London that would pay handsomely for what I'm about to tell you, and I did not survive 23 years in hiding only to be silenced the moment I resurface. They left the tavern together, Stellan, Dahlia, and the mother he'd believed dead since childhood, and made their way in tense silence to a private room Stellan secured at a nearby inn, one discreet enough to avoid the notice of London's gossips. It was there, with a fire crackling low in the hearth and the November wind rattling the window panes, that Helene Valen finally told her son the truth she had carried alone for over 2 decades. "Your father," she began, her hands wrapped tight around a cup of tea she did not drink, "was not the man history remembers him as. Publicly, the 4th Duke of Ravensmoor was a paragon devoted to the estate, respected in Parliament, mourned by all of society when he passed. privately, he was a man who could not tolerate the thought of a wife who challenged him, who dared to have opinions about how the estate's tenants were treated, who spoke against him in front of his own political allies when I believed he was wrong. Stellan sat rigid, his jaw tight, saying nothing. I discovered, in the year before my supposed death, that your father had been embezzling funds meant for tenant relief funds that should have gone toward rebuilding cottages damaged in the flood of that spring, toward feeding families who had lost their harvest. I confronted him. I told him I intended to expose it, to the estate's trustees, if not to the public directly, because I could not in good conscience watch families starve while he lined his own accounts. Her voice wavered, steadied. He did not take the threat well. What happened? Stellan's voice was barely above a whisper. I was to be sent away, Helene said, quietly, to an asylum in the north, under a diagnosis he purchased from a physician willing to lie for the right price. Hysteria, they called it. The same tired accusation men have leveled against inconvenient women for centuries. But before I could be taken, a friend, a woman who worked in this very house, in fact, though it operated under different management, then helped me escape London entirely. Your father, rather than risk the scandal of a duchess vanished and unaccounted for, staged my death instead. A fever, they said, swift and merciless. I understand the funeral was very moving. 23 years, Stellan said, and something in his voice cracked audibly, the sound of a lifetime of grief, suddenly recontextualized as something far crueler than mere loss. 23 years I believed I had failed to save you from illness. I have visited your grave every year on the anniversary. I have grieved you as though it were my fault. I could not have done more. I know! Tears finally slipped down Helene's weathered face. And I am so sorry, Stellan. I wanted to return the moment your father died. I heard of his death within weeks, through contacts I'd maintained, but by then you had already become Duke, already absorbed into a life built entirely around the lie of my death. I did not know how to return without destroying everything you'd built in the wreckage of what he'd done. I did not know how to face you and admit that I had chosen my own safety over remaining in your life, even in secret, even from a distance. Why now? Stellan asked. Why come forward now, after all this time? Helene's eyes moved briefly to Dahlia, who had been sitting silently throughout the entire devastating conversation, feeling like an intruder in a moment that belonged entirely to mother and son. Because I have heard whispers, Helene said carefully, that my son has finally found something worth risking everything for, and I did not want you to make the same mistake I once believed I had to make, choosing safety, choosing what was expected over what your heart demanded. I have spent 23 years regretting the version of myself who let fear dictate the shape of my life. I did not want to watch my son do the same. The room fell silent, the fire popping softly in the hearth, 3 lives suddenly and irrevocably altered by a truth 23 years buried. There is something else, Helene added, after a long moment, her expression shifting into something more guarded, more urgent. Your father did not act alone in orchestrating my disappearance. He had help from a family whose name you know well, whose alliance with the Ravensmoor estate has only deepened in the years since. I did not come forward sooner, in part, because I feared what exposing the truth might mean for you, given how entangled that family remains in your current affairs. Which family? Stellan asked, though something in his expression suggested he already suspected the answer, and dreaded it. The Earl of Sherborne, Helene said quietly, Lady Cordelia's father. The revelation should have changed everything about the proposed match between Stellan and Lady Cordelia, and in the privacy of the inn's small parlor, it very nearly did. Stellan spent the better part of an hour pacing, his fury a barely contained storm, demanding to know every detail his mother could recall of the Earl's involvement in her disappearance 23 years prior. But politics, Dahlia was quickly learning, rarely bent to something as simple as moral outrage. You cannot simply refuse the match now, his mother warned him, once his temper had cooled enough to listen. Not without proof beyond my own testimony, which the Earl will dismiss as the ravings of a woman long presumed dead and mentally unwell, precisely the narrative your father constructed to explain my disappearance in the first place. If you break the engagement without evidence, you hand Sherborne every advantage. He will paint you as an unstable duke abandoning a respectable match on the word of a ghost, and he will use it to discredit both of us thoroughly enough that no one will believe the truth even when it does surface. Then, what would you have me do? Stellan demanded. Marry his daughter regardless, knowing what I now know. I would have you be patient, Helene said, and clever, which I know you are capable of being. When you are not blinded by fury, gather proof. Find the physician who signed the false diagnosis, if he still lives. Find the staff who assisted in staging my death. Someone, somewhere, kept records, because men like your father and the Earl always believe themselves too clever to need to destroy every trace of their crimes. Build the case properly, and when you break the engagement, break it in a way that ruins Sherborne rather than yourself. It was, Dahlia recognized, exactly the kind of ruthless, careful strategy that had allowed Stellan's family to remain among the most powerful in England for centuries, and watching him absorb his mother's counsel, watching the fury in his eyes cool into something colder and more calculating, she felt, for the first time since falling in love with him, a flicker of unease at the world he truly belonged to. A world of leverage and legacy and strategic ruin, so far removed from the small, warm intimacy of their stolen Tuesday evenings that it was difficult, in that moment, to reconcile the two versions of the man she loved. "And in the meantime?" Stellan asked. "I am simply meant to continue courting a woman whose father conspired to have my mother committed." "In the meantime," Helene said gently, "you continue exactly as you have been, patient, careful, giving nothing away. And you protect whoever it is you've fallen for, Stellan, because if Sherborne suspects even for a moment that his daughter's engagement is in jeopardy, he will not hesitate to destroy the source of that jeopardy to secure the match. I have seen what that family is capable of. I would not wish it on anyone, least of all someone you love." Her gaze moved once more to Dahlia's steady, knowing, unmistakably a warning. Dahlia felt the weight of it settle over her like a shroud. She did not have long to wonder what form that danger might take. It arrived 3 days later, in the shape of a note delivered to the Wilting Rose by a boy who refused to say who had sent him, only that he'd been paid handsomely to place it directly in Dahlia Hartwell's hands, and no one else's. She opened it in the pantry, away from curious eyes, and felt her blood run cold as she read the elegant, looping script. "Miss Hartwell, I trust you are enjoying your Tuesday evenings. It would be such a shame if word of them reached the wrong ears. Your mother's illness is so very expensive to treat after all, and I understand physicians can be remarkably reluctant to continue their services to families whose reputations have been compromised. Consider this a friendly warning. Some doors, once opened by scandal, cannot be closed again. I would hate to see yours shut permanently." A well-wisher, the note was unsigned, but Dahlia did not need a signature to understand its origin. The elegant, cruel precision of the threat, the casual reference to her mother's illness, the veiled promise of ruin, it bore the unmistakable fingerprints of someone with money, power, and a willingness to use both against a woman who possessed neither. She did not tell Stellan. It was, she would later admit to herself, the first genuinely foolish decision of their entire relationship, but in the moment, staring at that note with her hands shaking, all she could think was that Stellan was already carrying the weight of his mother's 23-year exile, already calculating the delicate political strategy required to extricate himself from an engagement to a woman whose father had orchestrated unspeakable cruelty. She could not bring herself to add her own troubles to that burden. She told herself she was protecting him. She was, in truth, only delaying the inevitable. Lady Cordelia Ashcombe was not, contrary to the impression she cultivated in public, an unintelligent woman. She had noticed, over the preceding months, the particular way Stellan's attention had grown distant during their infrequent meetings, the way he seemed present in body, but absent in every way that mattered, the way his responses to her questions had grown polite but perfunctory, stripped of whatever genuine interest he might once have pretended to possess. She had noticed, too, the persistent rumor circulating among the household staff of both families' servants gossiped, always, regardless of how carefully their employers believed themselves to be guarding their secrets, that the Duke of Ravensmoor had been seen, repeatedly, at a modest tavern in an unfashionable part of London, in the company of a waitress. Cordelia had dismissed the rumor initially as beneath her notice. Men of Stellan's station occasionally indulged in dalliances beneath their station. It was practically expected, provided such indulgences remained appropriately discreet and did not interfere with the far more important business of securing an advantageous marriage. But as weeks passed and Stellan's distraction only deepened, as she began to suspect the dalliance had evolved into something considerably more threatening to her own carefully laid plans, Cordelia had done what any woman raised in the calculating world of the peerage would do. She had her father look into it, the Earl of Sherborne, upon learning that his daughter's prospective marriage, and the substantial political and financial advantages. It promised his family might be jeopardized by a mere tavern waitress, had responded with the particular ruthlessness that had allowed him to accumulate considerable power and wealth over his lifetime. It was the Earl himself, in fact, who had commissioned the anonymous note delivered to Dahlia at the Wilting Rose, calculating correctly, as it happened that a woman of her modest means and heavy family obligations could be frightened into retreat without any of the mess or scandal a more direct confrontation might invite. When the note failed to produce the desired effect, when Stellan continued his Tuesday visits, when the rumors of his infatuation continued to circulate rather than fade, the Earl escalated. He began, quietly, methodically, to make Dahlia Hartwell's life considerably more difficult. Her mother's physician, the one Stellan had quietly arranged from Harley Street, abruptly declared himself unable to continue treatment, citing a scheduling conflict that materialized with suspicious convenience. The same week, the Earl began making inquiries about the doctor's other, wealthier clients. The Wilting Rose, which had operated without incident for 15 years, suddenly found itself the subject of an unexpected and thorough health inspection, one that threatened, for several tense days, to shutter the establishment entirely over infractions that had never before been enforced with such vigor. And Dahlia herself began to notice, with the particular unease of someone being watched, a man in a dark coat who seemed to appear with unsettling frequency near her flat, near the tavern, near the small grocer where she purchased what medicine she could still afford. She said nothing to Stellan, still convinced she could weather it alone, still unwilling to add her own burdens to his. It was a mistake that would very nearly cost her everything. The confrontation, when it finally came, arrived not through the Earl's careful machinations, but through Lady Cordelia's own wounded pride. She arrived at the Wilting Rose on a bitter evening in early December, unannounced, without her father's knowledge, driven by a jealousy she could no longer contain through calculated schemes alone. She found Dahlia clearing tables near closing, the tavern nearly empty, and approached with the particular cold fury of a woman who believed, however unfairly, that everything wrong in her life could be traced back to the Curvy Waitress standing before her. "You will end this," Cordelia said without preamble, her voice low and shaking with barely controlled rage. "Whatever this is between you and the Duke of Ravensmoor, you will end it tonight, and you will never speak to him again." Dahlia set down the plates she was carrying with deliberate care, steadying herself before she answered. "I don't believe that's your decision to make, my lady." "It is precisely my decision to make." Cordelia's composure cracked, just slightly, revealing the raw hurt beneath the practiced hauteur. "Do you have any idea what you are risking? Not merely for yourself, though. God knows a woman of your station has little enough to lose, but for him, for his entire family, his entire legacy. The Ravensmoor name has survived for 300 years through careful, strategic alliance. A duke does not marry a tavern waitress, no matter how charmingly she debates philosophy over cheap port. If you truly cared for him, you would understand that loving him means releasing him." The words struck closer to Dahlia's own private fears than she wanted to admit, and for a moment, standing in the dim, closing tavern with Cordelia's pale eyes fixed on her with such raw, wounded intensity, Dahlia felt the full weight of everything she had been trying not to consider: the gulf between them, the impossibility of a future, the very real danger her presence in Stellan's life posed to everything he had ever known. But beneath that fear was something else, something steadier, something that had carried her through years of exhausting shifts and mounting debts, and a mother's worsening illness without once breaking. "I understand loving someone means wanting good things for them," Dahlia said quietly. "But I don't believe good things for Stellan means marrying a woman who threatens the people he cares about to secure her own position. I don't believe good things for him means pretending. For the rest of his life, that duty and happiness can never coexist. And I don't believe, my lady, that it's your place or your father's to decide what he's permitted to want." Cordelia's face went white. "What did you just say about my father?" Dahlia realized too late. Her mistake, the note, the threats, the vanished physician, all of it suddenly connecting in Cordelia's expression into a suspicion the woman had clearly not previously entertained. "Nothing," Dahlia said quickly. "I misspoke." But Cordelia was already backing toward the door, her mind visibly working through implications Dahlia had not intended to reveal, her pale eyes narrowing with a dangerous, calculating light. "My father has been managing this situation," she said slowly, more to herself than to Dahlia. "He told me not to concern myself with it, that it would resolve itself. I assumed he meant persuasion. I did not realize he meant... She stopped herself, some vestige of family loyalty catching the words before they formed. "This changes things," she said instead, and left without another word, her expensive skirt sweeping through the tavern door into the frozen December night. Dahlia stood alone in the empty dining room, her heart pounding, understanding with sudden, sick clarity that whatever careful equilibrium had existed between herself, Stellan, and the powerful families circling their romance had just been irrevocably shattered. She was right to be afraid, but she could not have predicted, that December night, exactly how the fracture would manifest 3 weeks later in the middle of the season's grandest ball, in front of 300 witnesses, with a shout that would freeze all of high society in place. The Earl of Sherborne, upon learning from his daughter that his private machinations against Dahlia Hartwell had very nearly been exposed, made a decision that would ultimately prove his own undoing. Rather than retreat, rather than accept that his daughter's engagement to the Duke of Ravensmoor might not, after all, be secured through quiet coercion, he escalated his campaign into something considerably more brazen and considerably more public. He engineered an invitation, extended formally through Lady Cordelia's mother, for Dahlia Hartwell to attend the grand ball marking the formal announcement of Cordelia's engagement to the Duke, an invitation that made no sense whatsoever for a tavern waitress to receive, and which the Earl fully intended as a trap. He would have Dahlia present, humiliated in front of London's most powerful families, exposed as an inappropriate dalliance beneath the Duke's dignity, and in doing so, force Stellan's hand entirely. Either abandon Dahlia publicly to save face, or refuse to abandon her and destroy his own reputation so thoroughly that the engagement to Cordelia would proceed by sheer necessity, as the only path back to respectability remaining to him. Dahlia, receiving the invitation with bewildered suspicion, very nearly declined. It was Helene Stellan's mother who had taken to meeting Dahlia privately in the weeks since her dramatic return, forming an unlikely but genuine friendship built on shared understanding of what it meant to love a valiant man and suffer for it, who convinced her otherwise. "If you do not attend," Helene said, "Sherborne will simply construct another trap, and another, until one finally succeeds. You cannot outrun a man with his resources and his patience, but you can, perhaps, deny him the satisfaction of watching you crumble when he springs it. And if I go, and everything falls apart in front of all those people—" "Then it falls apart," Helene said. "On your terms, not his. There is a difference, Dahlia, between tragedy that happens to you and tragedy you walk into with your eyes open, prepared to fight. I spent 23 years being the former. I would not wish it on you." Stellan, when informed of the earl's scheme by his mother, rather than by Dahlia herself, a small betrayal of trust that stung sharper than either woman anticipated, was initially furious that Dahlia had concealed the threats against her for weeks, the vanished physician, the man watching her flat, the note that had started it all. "You should have told me," he said, his voice tight with a fear that manifested, as fear often did in him, as anger. "I could have protected you. I could have ended this before it ever reached this point." "I didn't want to be one more burden you had to carry," Dahlia admitted, "on top of everything with your mother, on top of the political strategy, on top of an entire dukedom's worth of expectation already pressing down on you. I wanted to handle it myself." "You are not a burden," Stellan said, gripping her hands with an intensity that left no room for doubt. "You are the only thing in my life I have ever chosen freely, without calculation, without strategy. I would rather carry every burden you could possibly bring to me than watch you suffer alone because you believed yourself unworthy of my help. Promise me, Dahlia, promise me you will never again decide unilaterally to protect me from the truth. We face this together, or we do not survive it at all," she promised. It was a promise that would be tested sooner and more brutally than either of them anticipated. Because the ball, when it finally arrived, brought with it not only the Earl's carefully constructed trap, but a piece of information so devastating that Stellan would lose, entirely and publicly, the careful composure he had spent 34 years perfecting. The night of the grand ball arrived with the particular glittering menace of a trap dressed up as celebration. Lord Ashcombe's townhouse had been transformed for the occasion into something out of a fairy tale gone slightly wrong, thousands of candles blazing in crystal chandeliers, hothouse flowers imported at extraordinary expense despite the December frost outside, an orchestra positioned to provide the evening soundtrack of triumphant celebratory waltzes, 300 of London's most powerful families had been invited to witness the formal announcement of the match between the Duke of Ravensmoor and Lady Cordelia Ashcombe, and every one of them arrived, dressed in their finest, eager for both spectacle and gossip in equal measure. Dahlia arrived separately at the servants' entrance initially, before catching sight of the invitation in her gloved hand, an invitation extended, however maliciously, by Lady Cordelia's own mother, and squaring her shoulders to walk instead through the front doors like the guest she had technically, if not genuinely, been invited to be. She had borrowed a gown from Nettie's older sister, a seamstress who had, upon hearing the full story from an anxious, sworn-to-secrecy Nettie, insisted on altering it specifically to fit Dahlia's curves rather than force her into something designed for a narrower frame. It was deep burgundy silk, simple but well made, and when Dahlia caught her own reflection in the hallway mirror before entering the ballroom, she barely recognized the woman looking back at her, not because the gown transformed her into something she wasn't, but because, for the first time in longer than she could remember, she looked like exactly what she was, presented without apology. The whispers began the moment she entered the ballroom. "Who is she? That figure, surely she's not one of us. Look at that dress, straining at the seams, how positively common. Is that the Duke's waitress? Surely not. Surely he wouldn't dare bring her here." Tonight of all nights, Dahlia heard every word, felt every judgmental glance sweep across her body with the particular cruelty reserved for women who dared to occupy space without shame. She kept her chin level, her shoulders back, and searched the glittering crowd for the one face that mattered. She found Stellan near the center of the room, standing beside Lady Cordelia in a receiving line, his expression carved from stone, his eyes scanning the crowd with the restless intensity of a man searching for something or someone he both dreaded and desperately needed to find. Their eyes met across the ballroom. Something passed between them in that instant relief, fear, and love so raw it was nearly visible to anyone watching closely enough before the Earl of Sherborne, materializing at Dahlia's elbow with the smooth, predatory grace of a man closing in on his prey, spoke directly into her ear. "Miss Hartwell," he said, his voice pitched low but carrying an unmistakable threat. "How lovely that you could join us. I do hope you understand the significance of tonight's occasion. My daughter's engagement to the Duke will be formally announced within the hour, before every important family in London. It would be a terrible shame if anything or anyone were to disrupt such a joyous occasion." "I have no intention of causing a scene, my lord," Dahlia said, keeping her voice level despite the fury building in her chest. "See that you don't," the Earl said, and smiled with all the warmth of a closing trap. "I hate for word to reach certain physicians, certain landlords, certain establishments that continue employing you, regarding just how complicated your presence here tonight has become." He melted back into the crowd before she could respond, leaving Dahlia standing alone amid a sea of silk and diamonds, her heart pounding, understanding fully now the trap she had walked into. It was then, as the orchestra shifted into a new arrangement and Lord Ashcombe stepped forward to call the room to attention for the evening's formal announcement, that a second disturbance rippled through the crowd, a disturbance that would, within minutes, collide catastrophically with the first. Helene Vallon entered the ballroom. She had not been invited. She arrived instead through sheer force of will and the assistance of a footman loyal to her son, moving through the stunned crowd with the bearing of a woman who had once been the most respected duchess in England and had never entirely forgotten how to command a room, regardless of how many years had passed since she'd last claimed the right. "I believe," Helene announced, her voice carrying clearly across the sudden startled silence, "that before any formal announcement proceeds tonight, there is a matter of considerable relevance that this room deserves to hear." Lord Ashcombe, thoroughly bewildered, looked toward the Earl of Sherborne for guidance. The Earl's face had gone the particular shade of white that indicated genuine, unmasked panic. "Helene," the Earl said, his voice strained. "This is neither the time nor—" "It is precisely the time," Helene said, "given that the announcement about to be made concerns my son's engagement, and given that your role in orchestrating my supposed death 23 years ago is directly relevant to whether that engagement should be permitted to proceed at all." The ballroom erupted into a cacophony of gasps and whispers, 300 voices rising in shocked unison as the implications of Helene's words rippled outward through the crowd. The Duchess of Ravensmoor, presumed dead for over 2 decades, stood very much alive in the middle of the season's grandest ball, publicly accusing the Earl of Sherborne of conspiracy. Stellan moved immediately to his mother's side, his expression a controlled mask that Dahlia watching from across the room, her own heart hammering with a terrible premonition of what was coming, recognized as the thin veneer over a fury building toward eruption. "This is precisely the moment," he said, his voice carrying with the particular authority that came from a lifetime of command, "to discuss it fully. Lord Sherborne, perhaps you would care to explain to this gathering exactly what role you played in my father's crimes against my mother?" The Earl, cornered, panicking, made the catastrophic decision that would ultimately unravel everything. "I played no role beyond keeping a confidence, Your Grace," the Earl said, his voice gaining a desperate, sneering edge as he pivoted, with the instinct of a man who had survived scandal before by redirecting blame toward the one target in the room he believed vulnerable enough to sacrifice. "Though I might ask why you're so quick to defend your mother's reputation while entertaining a mistress beneath your own roof for the better part of 6 months. Perhaps the room would find that revelation rather more scandalous than ancient history." Every eye in the ballroom swung toward Dahlia. "She is not my mistress," Stellan said, his voice suddenly, dangerously quiet. "No?" The Earl's confidence returned, sensing an opening. "Then what precisely is your relationship with a tavern waitress you've been secretly courting for months, Your Grace? Do enlighten us. I'm certain everyone here would find the explanation fascinating." Stellan turned, his gray eyes finding Dahlia across the crowded ballroom, and for one suspended, agonizing moment, she watched him war visibly with everything he had ever been taught about duty, about legacy, about the careful strategic patience his mother had counseled just weeks earlier. Then something in his expression shifted, hardened, resolved, and Dahlia understood, with a lurch of terror, that he was about to abandon every careful plan they had constructed and simply tell the truth, consequences be damned. "She is the woman I love," Stellan said, his voice carrying clearly across the frozen ballroom. "The only person in this entire room who has ever wanted anything from me beyond what my title could provide, and I would rather stand disgraced beside her than stand respectable beside anyone else for the rest of my life." The room erupted into chaos, gasps, whispers, Lady Cordelia's stricken cry, the Earl's furious sputtering, and it was into this chaos that the final, catastrophic piece fell into place. Because it was in this moment, with Stellan's declaration hanging in the air, with 300 witnesses absorbing the scandal unfolding before them, that a very different, very dangerous man arrived at the periphery of the ballroom, having tracked the disturbance from the street outside where he'd been keeping watch on Dahlia for weeks at the Arl's direction. A man who, upon witnessing the Duke's public declaration and understanding it as the final failure of the Arl's scheme, made his own desperate, panicked calculation that if he could not prevent the scandal through quiet threats, he would prevent it by removing its cause entirely. Dahlia never saw him approach. She only felt a hand close roughly around her arm from behind, yanking her toward the ballroom's side entrance with brutal force. A low voice hissing in her ear that she would regret humiliating the Earl's family, that some lessons required more than threats to properly teach. Her cry of alarm was swallowed by the general chaos of the room until Stellan, scanning the crowd desperately for her face, and finding it disappearing toward a side door in the grip of a stranger, felt something in him break entirely. It was in that instant, seeing the woman he loved being dragged from the ballroom by a man clearly intent on harming her, that the Duke of Ravensmoor's carefully cultivated composure shattered completely, and his voice tore through the ballroom in a shout that froze every remaining conversation into stunned silence. "Get your hands off her." The room turned as one. Stellan was already moving, cutting through the crowd with a speed and violence that startled even those who had known him for decades, reaching the stranger before he could drag Dahlia through the side door and driving his fist into the man's jaw with enough force to send him sprawling across the marble floor. The man, one of the Earl's hired men, as would later be confirmed by the magistrate's investigation, scrambled backward, clearly recognizing that whatever payment he'd been promised did not extend to physical confrontation with an enraged Duke, and fled through the very door he'd been attempting to drag Dahlia toward, disappearing into the December night before anyone could stop him. Stellan turned immediately to Dahlia, his hands cradling her face with a desperate tenderness entirely at odds with the violence of moments before, his gray eyes searching hers for any sign of injury. "Are you hurt? Dahlia, look at me, are you hurt?" "I'm all right," she managed, though her voice shook with the aftermath of terror. "Stellan, I'm all right." He pulled her against his chest, his arms wrapping around her with fierce, protective intensity. and it was only then, with 300 witnesses watching in stunned, absolute silence, that he turned back toward the Earl of Sherborne, his expression transformed into something cold and terrible. "You," Stellan said, his voice low and lethal, "sent that man after her." "I did no such thing," the Earl protested, though his voice had gone thin with panic, his face ashen as the full weight of public exposure descended upon him. "We shall let the magistrate determine that," Stellan said, "along with your role in my mother's disappearance 23 years ago, and your systematic harassment of Miss Hartwell over these past months, the vanished physician, the threatening notes, the health inspector suddenly discovering infractions that never previously existed at her place of employment. I imagine, given sufficient investigation, quite a thorough case will present itself." The Earl's composure crumbled entirely under the weight of public scrutiny. 300 witnesses now recalculating everything they thought they understood about the season's most powerful families. Lady Cordelia, standing frozen and humiliated at the center of a scandal entirely of her father's making, finally broke her own silence, not in defense of her father, but in something that looked, unexpectedly, like relief. "I want no part of this marriage," she announced, her voice trembling but clear. "I never truly wanted it. If I am honest, I wanted the security it promised, and I am ashamed to admit I allowed my father to pursue that security through means I should never have permitted. Your Grace, I release you from any obligation, real or perceived, toward our match. I am deeply sorry for the pain my family has caused you both." It was, Dahlia would later reflect, the single moment of genuine grace in an evening otherwise defined by scandal and violence. Lady Cordelia, whatever her earlier cruelties, choosing in the end to step aside rather than cling to an engagement built on her father's crimes. But the ballroom's attention had already shifted entirely toward Dahlia, toward the Curvy Waitress, who had just been physically assaulted in the middle of London's grandest ball, who stood now in the circle of the Duke of Ravensmoor's protective embrace, her borrowed burgundy gown slightly torn at the shoulder from her attacker's grip, her dark curls disheveled, and yet who met the room's stunned, judgmental stares without flinching. It was Lady Featherington, an elderly countess renowned throughout the peerage for her sharp tongue and sharper judgment, who finally broke the silence, her voice carrying across the frozen ballroom with the particular authority of a woman who had survived 7 decades of society's cruelties and had grown thoroughly tired of watching them repeated. "Well," the Countess said, studying Dahlia with an expression that had shifted, somewhere in the preceding minutes, from disdain to something considerably more respectful. "I dare say this young woman has shown more courage tonight than the rest of this entire room combined. Attacked by a hired thug, humiliated by a scheming earl, and she's still standing there with her chin up, rather than dissolving into the vapors like any of the rest of you would have managed." She turned toward the Duke. "Ravensmoor, if you've any sense at all remaining after that display, you'll marry the girl before some other fool recognizes what you clearly already have." A ripple of surprised laughter moved through the shocked crowd, nervous at first, then genuine, the tension of the evening finally beginning to crack under the Countess's blunt pronouncement. Stellan, still holding Dahlia close, looked down at her with an expression that held equal parts exhaustion, relief, and a fierce, unshakable love that made her breath catch despite everything that had just transpired. "The Countess," he said quietly, for Dahlia's ears alone, "is not wrong." "Stellan," Dahlia said, her voice unsteady, "we don't have to decide anything tonight, not after everything that's just happened." "I have spent 34 years deciding nothing for myself," he said. "Tonight, in front of every important family in London, I have already told them the truth about my heart. I find I have no desire to retreat from it now." His hand cupped her face, gentle despite the chaos still swirling around them. "I love you, Dahlia Hartwell, not despite what you are, but precisely because of it, because you are honest, and unafraid, and kinder than anyone I have ever known, and because you have never once asked me to be anything other than exactly who I am when I am with you. I would very much like to spend the rest of my life being that man. Would you allow me to?" Dahlia, standing in the wreckage of a scandal that had exposed a 23-year-old crime, ended a manufactured engagement, and very nearly gotten her physically harmed, found herself laughing a startled, disbelieving sound, half sob even as tears finally spilled down her cheeks. "You're asking me to marry you," she said, "in the middle of a ballroom, 30 seconds after punching a man who tried to kidnap me." "I am asking you," Stellan said, "because I have learned, this past week, precisely how quickly everything can be taken from us if we wait too long to claim what we want. I do not intend to make that mistake again." "Then yes," Dahlia said, her voice breaking on the word, even as joy flooded through the exhaustion and fear of the evening. "Yes, Stellan, of course, yes." The ballroom, which had spent the last quarter hour absorbing scandal after scandal, erupted into applause, hesitant at first, then genuine. 300 of London's most powerful witnesses watching a duke kiss a curvy waitress in the middle of a ballroom, and finding themselves, against every instinct their upbringing had cultivated, moved by the sight rather than scandalized by it. The weeks that followed brought their own reckoning. The Earl of Sherborne was formally investigated, the magistrate's inquiry uncovering not only his role in harassing Dahlia the vanished physician bribed into silence, the fabricated health violations, the hired man who had attempted to drag her from the ballroom, but also corroborating evidence of his involvement, decades earlier, in helping the late Duke of Ravensmoor stage his wife's death. Faced with certain conviction and complete social ruin, the Earl fled to the continent before formal charges could be filed, his estate seized to cover the damages owed to those he'd wronged, his title stripped by royal decree within the year. Lady Cordelia, remarkably, weathered her father's disgrace with a quiet dignity that surprised everyone who had previously dismissed her as merely vain. She retreated from London society for a time, but returned eventually, chastened and genuinely changed, and would, in the years that followed, become an unexpected but sincere friend to the very woman she had once tried to intimidate into retreat. Helene Vallon resumed her place within her son's life, not as Duchess that title now belonged, joyously, to Dahlia, but as a beloved mother finally free to simply exist without the burden of secrecy she'd carried for 23 years. She and Dahlia grew close in the months that followed, bonded by their shared understanding of exactly what it cost to love a Vallon man and choose, despite every obstacle, to remain. Dahlia's mother, Josephine, lived to see her daughter married in a ceremony that filled Ravensmoor Cathedral with more genuine joy than Pomp. Stellan had insisted on that distinction specifically, refusing the elaborate spectacle his position technically demanded in favor of something smaller, warmer, filled with the people who actually mattered, rather than the obligatory guest list of political allies and social climbers. Josephine's health, thanks to the finest care London's physicians could provide, stabilized enough that she lived to see her first grandchild born 18 months later, a daughter, dark-haired and already fiercely opinionated, whom Dahlia and Stellan named Helene, in honor of the mother whose courage had ultimately saved them all. The wilting rose remained, at Dahlia's insistence, exactly as it had always been, a small, unglamorous tavern, where a duke had once fallen in love with a waitress over cheap port and philosophical debate. She visited often, in the years that followed, no longer serving tables but simply sitting at their old corner table with Stellan, watching the current generation of waitresses navigate the same exhausting shifts and difficult customers she once had, and remembering, always, that the most extraordinary love stories rarely announce themselves with grandeur. Sometimes they simply begin with a wet, irritated duke walking through the wrong door on a rainy Tuesday evening, and a waitress brave enough to tell him that being strange wasn't the worst thing a man could be. High society, which had once frozen at the sound of a duke's shout across a crowded ballroom, eventually came to speak of that night in reverent, romantic tones. The night the Duke of Ravensmoor chose love over legacy, and discovered, in doing so, that the two were never truly opposed to begin with. Dahlia Hartwell, once dismissed and underestimated for the body society told her to apologize for, became one of the most beloved duchesses London had seen in a generation, not despite her curves, not despite her working-class origins, but because of the fierce, unapologetic honesty those experiences had forged in her. She never forgot what it felt like to be looked down upon, and she spent her years as duchess ensuring that no woman in her household, no tenant on her estate, no visitor to her home would ever be made to feel small for simply existing as she was. And Stellan, the Duke who had spent 34 years being exactly what everyone expected of him, finally, fully became the man he'd only glimpsed in stolen Tuesday evenings present, protective, unafraid to shout in defense of the woman he loved, and equally unafraid to laugh, freely and often, in the warmth of a home finally built on honesty rather than obligation. If this story moved something in you, we'd love for you to be part of the Royal Duke Diaries family. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next tale of forbidden love, hidden truths, and hearts brave enough to choose what's real over what's expected. Drop a comment and tell us, What moment in Dahlia and Stellan's story stayed with you? Give this video a like if you believe love shouldn't have to apologize for the space it takes up in the world. Thank you for spending this time with us. Until the next story, stay hopeful, stay unapologetic, and never let anyone convince you that you're too much of anything. You are exactly enough.